Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me start with Professor Jefferson. Thanks for coming by my office and for our discussion recently. During the course of our conversation, you said to me, I think this is pretty close to a verbatim quote, that the Fed board has no role in the allocation of capital, period, end quote. So just for the record here this morning, is that a fair characterization of your view?
I stand by that quote, Senator.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Raskin, I've heard what you've said this morning. I saw your testimony. But from your repeated speeches, op-eds, podcasts, all kinds of sources, right up to very recent times, it seems very clear to me that you believe that climate change is a very, very dire, imminent threat, that it will be catastrophic. I think you've used the word existential, and that for those reasons, it is necessary and appropriate for financial regulators, including the Fed, to allocate capital away from those companies that are contributing the most to the carbon in the atmosphere. Isn't that true?
Thank you, Senator Toomey. It is inappropriate for the Fed to make credit decisions and allocations based on choosing winners and losers. Banks choose their borrowers. The Fed does not. It is inappropriate for the Fed to choose winners and losers, and to do so is not the proper institutional role of the Fed. That is, as I said, a cardinal principle of Fed supervision.
Okay, I hear you say this, but the problem is the huge documented weight where you have said something very, very different. In the Financial Times in January of 2021, you wrote an op-ed. In that you said, and I quote, "Next, the financial supervisors will need to know how to act on this information. Supervisory adjustments will have to take climate disclosures into account, and the Fed will need to use climate risk data to make decisions on asset purchases," end quote. At UC Berkeley, at a forum speech that you gave in April of 2021, you said, and I quote, "I have come to a singular recognition, and it is this. In order to maximize the speed and safety of a move into a sustainable, durable, net zero economy and away from climate change disaster, we need to use the financial regulatory apparatus to engage financial markets and financial institutions in affecting both direction and pace," end quote. In June of 2020, the Saris report came out, and you wrote, and I quote, "At the very least, we must rebuild with an economy where the values of sustainability are explicitly embedded in market valuation. This transformation will come in part from urging the leaders of our financial regulatory bodies to do all they can," which turns out to be a lot, "to bring about the adoption of practices and policies that will allocate capital and align portfolios towards sustainable investments that do not depend on carbon and fossil fuels," end quote. How is that not advocating that regulators pressure the financial institutions to allocate capital the way the regulators want?
Well, it is, of course, not the role of the Fed to be directing credit allocation. They do not choose winners and losers. The way supervision works is by looking at risk, and by looking at risk wherever it may arise. You look at that risk, and you have to do it in a very, honest way, and ask yourself whether there is any correlation between that risk and the ability to hurt a financial institution.
Are you saying you no longer hold these views that you've stated about allocating capital as a result of your perception of this risk?
My views have been consistent, Senator. The Fed should not pick winners and losers. They should not be exposing taxpayers to undue risk.
Well, okay, I'm sorry, that there is no reasonable reading of these articles and speeches that can come to a conclusion other than that you want to be allocating capital away from those industries that are generating large amounts of CO2. I'm sorry, I know you're saying something different here this morning, but that's not what you've been saying in writing for several years now. Let me move over to Professor Cook. I've heard you talk about the importance of getting inflation under control, but we had a phone conversation a couple of days ago. In that conversation, I specifically asked you whether you agreed with and supported the Fed's recent decision to gradually begin the process of removing the ultra-easy money policy, or whether you thought they were acting prematurely. And what you said was, well, somewhere in between. So I'm wondering if you can clarify that. But let me ask a simple question. Do you now support the Fed's current path of accelerating the tapering and moving on to a series of interest rate increases over the course of this year?
Senator, thank you for that question. I am certainly, when I think about these issues, I would like to look at the data and evidence that would be at one's disposal, if confirmed, to be able to make a decision about this. So I did say it was somewhere in between before, and I agree with the Fed's path right now as we're speaking. But when we get to a decision point, I would look to the data, the evidence that would be made available at that time.
Okay, well, there's a tremendous amount of data that's out there, right? I mean, there's no secrets or mystery about what the Fed's monetary policy is at any point in time. There's no secret or mystery about economic data generally. There's thousands of people across the country that are constantly analyzing it. It seems you've shifted from the in-between answer to now saying you support what the Fed's doing. It's confusing to me, and so could you give us some sense of how you view the policies that are available to the Fed, how you think about what we should be doing at this moment? Have your thoughts on the Phillips curve change given the developments in recent years? Are you concerned about the change in what's happening with the shape of the yield curve? Do you think exchange rates are an important mechanism? How do we get inflation under control?
Thank you for that question, Senator. I understand that every day Americans are suffering from high inflation. This is something that I learned a lesson about more recently, probably than most people. I've lived in countries and advised countries in a situation of hyperinflation. So I am motivated by seeing the suffering of workers, of businesses, in just trying to plan their everyday lives and facing an inflationary environment. The way I would think about it would be, along with, if confirmed, along with the deliberation. So you're right, there's a lot of data available, we don't have access to all the data the Federal Reserve has, but we have a lot. And what we don't have access to is the deliberations at the time that they're being made. And I work collaboratively. I'd like to hear arguments as they are being made. And with respect to the shape of the Phillips curve, what we know in economics is that this is an open research question. We know that there's a trade-off between unemployment and inflation, but we don't necessarily know what that relationship is. And in times of uncertainty, and this is sort of my specialty, in places of uncertainty in emerging markets and developing countries, what we know is that we have to be patient with the data. We have to ask about the data, whether the data have changed, if they are reliable, and still valid. So I would make sure that I pose questions of the data we were receiving and engage with the deliberations with my colleagues with an open mind, if confirmed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Toomey. Senator Reid, Rhode Island.